Hello, this is another video on Bitcoin post-quantum strategy. How are we going to get there? And in a previous video, I talked about how there are different choices. For instance, what kind of transaction signature are you going to use? What kind of post-quantum crypto are you going to use? There are choices on how to structure the migration, like what is the timeline, when to disable pre-quantum crypto, elliptic curve cryptography. There are also other questions like how to deal with lost coins. Here we are focusing on only one question, that is, what is the post-quantum transaction output type? That is not the same as asking what transaction signature are you going to use, because you have to put the signature somewhere in a transaction output. And there are choices to be made here. There are technical questions that are intertwined with governance questions and strategic questions. You really can't separate the two. And that's very, that's very interesting to me, at least. So let's go there. First of all, what are we talking about? What is a transaction output? The thing here is that all coins in Bitcoin are, let's say, stored in UTXOs. UTXOs, or unspent transaction outputs, define how a certain amount of coins can be spent. What are the rules to spend these coins? And the rules are different, and they can be classified according to the type of output. So for instance, P2TRh is a type of transaction output. P2Taproot is another type of transaction output. And they're structured in different ways, and they have advantages and drawbacks. Some are more expensive, some are more efficient, some are vulnerable to cryptographically relevant quantum computer at rest, some only during spending. There are different trade-offs here, but what they all have in common is that there is no support for post-quantum transaction signatures. So at the very least, the new transaction output for a post-quantum migration should have the possibility to spend these coins with the post-quantum cryptography. So that's one need for the post-quantum ready transaction output type, but it's not the only one. There are other design choices to make, and that's why it's not obvious to say already today what is going to be the post-quantum transaction output in Bitcoin. There is a proposal we already talked about, that is BIP360, P2MR root, P2MR, but it's not the only possible option. There are more that are being discussed, and that's the purpose basically of this video, to describe what are the options that are discussed today and what are the trade-offs. So let's go through it. I mentioned that, yes, one need is that it has to support post-quantum transaction signatures, the new output. Otherwise, what's the point? But there are other trade-offs and other design choices. So for instance, you want to decide if the transaction output should be secure at rest or not against quantum computers. This is addressing the long exposure risk from CRQCs. So there are transaction outputs for which the elliptic, there is already, even though they allow you to do a post-quantum transaction signature to spend coins, there is also embedded in it an elliptic curve cryptography key, public key, such that people can, with quantum computers, can immediately steal coins from you. And you might wonder, why would you do that? There are reasons, and that's the point of the video. But this is a possibility. You can classify all the types of post-quantum transaction outputs on whether they are secure at rest against CRQCs or not. Another differentiator between different transaction outputs is whether the disabling of elliptic curve cryptography is easy to do, expected to do, or it's even needed because maybe there is no need for the transaction output. So that's a choice also, how the post-quantum transaction output affects the fact that you have to disable ECC at some point. Another question is cost efficiency, and this is affecting adoption, because if the post-quantum transaction output is very expensive to spend compared to the standard, the transactional outputs that we have today, will people migrate to it willingly and in advance before a CRQC exists, or it's even close to exist? Maybe not. So that's a question. You have to think about the incentives for people to migrate to the post-quantum transaction output. And some outputs might be more, for those outputs, it might be easier to convince people to do the migration. So that's the third question. And the fourth, what happens after the migration? So like when the migration is done, is this transaction output efficient? Is it a good transaction output in general? Or is there some debt coming from the fact that you wanted to incentivize the migration in advance? So these are some of the questions that are discussed, and there is, as usual, and that's why it's interesting, there is no easy, perfect solution that gets everything perfect for free. And here in this video, we will look at these 4 types of transaction outputs. This is the BIP360, P2MR. We have also P2QR, P2TRv2, so Taproot v2, and P2TRH, okay? And yeah, I mentioned 4 questions, 4 trade-offs, but in general, you can also focus on these axes. Some are cheaper and incentivize migration now, but what they trade is the possibility to enforce security without any future coordination. So this is something that maybe you lose if you go for a cheaper or more incentivized migration now. But we will see the details. But first of all, I want to clarify, these are all based on Taproot. Okay, so it's good to know how Taproot works because they are all a sort of upgrade of Taproot or change or building on top of Taproot. Why Taproot? Because Taproot is good. It works well. It has many benefits and many ways to use Bitcoin are allowed or enabled by Taproot. Taproot gives you efficiency, but it gives you also privacy on what are the spending conditions that are in the leaves. You don't need to reveal them all. And yeah, it's a good transaction output. There is a problem, is that it's quantum vulnerable. And not only it's quantum vulnerable when you spend the coins, that would be true for any transaction output that we have today, because there is no post-quantum transaction signature, but it's also vulnerable at rest, meaning that there are at least 2 main ways to spend coins in Taproot. You have a script path and you have a key path. And the key path allows you to spend coins with just one Schnorr signature, that is elliptic curve cryptography, and the public key is exposed. It's there at rest. It's not hidden in any way. There is no hash behind that. It's publicly available, and anyone with a CRQC can then derive the corresponding private key and spend the coins, spend the UTXO like that immediately, just exploiting this key path. The key path is there to make Taproot efficient because it's the cheapest way to spend the coins, and it's typically what is done in case there is no need to go through whatever more complicated way you have to spend the same coins, because there might be some contract in this script, in the script path. You don't need to reveal that. That's the privacy win. When everybody agrees, then you go for the key path spend, and that works. But that's the efficiency win, but it's also the vulnerability, because it means that anybody can just spend these coins if they have a CRQC. So this is the key path, and then, yes, I mentioned the script path, and what is stored is only the root. You don't see the leaves on chain. You will see one leaf when it's spent. So only the selected leaf is revealed. These are different encoded spending conditions that are allowed because they are in this Merkle tree. So the thing is, none of these leaves, of course, is a post-quantum transaction signature. There is no post-quantum signature as possible spending condition. That's why Taproot must be upgraded, not only because of this vulnerability, we can say, but also because there is no way to define post-quantum transaction signatures as a way to spend the coins. So let's go to P2MR. This is the first post-quantum transaction output we are discussing here. It's, again, based on Taproot, and the easiest way to describe it is it's like Taproot, but there is no key path. So there is no key path spending condition. There is no exposed public key from which you can derive a private key using Shor's algorithm. That's gone. We remove completely the key path. You keep the structure of the Merkle tree with all the different leaves that define the spending conditions. And on top of that, you have the possibility to define a post-quantum leaf. So post-quantum transaction signatures would be supported by this output type. Now, to be clear, BIP360 does not include yet this, the selection, a specific post-quantum transaction signatures like shrimps and shrinks are not already embedded in BIP360 or whatever other alternative. That's not there yet. But in this video, we talked about P2MR and the benefits of P2MR, assuming that there is such a possibility. So what is the advantage respect to P2TR? Taproot is, yes, there is no direct way to spend the coins just by using the public key and deriving the private key, because there is no public key stored on chain. So this protects from long exposure attacks. However, in P2MR, it would still be possible to define an ECC leaf. So you might have both an ECC leaf and a PQ leaf, allowing users to spend the coins either with elliptic curve cryptography or with post-quantum cryptography. But difference with P2TR is that this elliptic curve cryptography leaf and the corresponding public key is not exposed until you spend the coins. So that's still a vulnerability, or anyway, it can be attacked by a quantum computer, but this would be a short exposure attack because the quantum computer has to be fast enough to see the transaction in the mempool and immediately derive the private key and try to replace this spending operation, this transaction, with its own transaction. So that's a different kind of threat, but it's still a vulnerability. Probably you still want to disable elliptic curve cryptography at some point, but that's another question. What is for sure is that here you are protected from long exposure attacks and you can use post-quantum transaction signatures. Now, what do you lose compared to P2TR Taproot is that, yes, you can still use elliptic curve cryptography, and that's a good thing. You want to keep this optionality because ideally you want to do this migration long before, or at least before the CRQCs are widely available or available at all. But if you're asking people to migrate before CRQCs are a thing, users still want to spend using elliptic curve cryptography because it's cheaper, right? But yeah, the problem is that it would be cheaper than using post-quantum transaction signature, but it would be more expensive than using Taproot. So you're asking people to do this migration, but suddenly their spending operations will be more expensive than using Taproot, while gaining nothing in return in the immediate short term, because CRQCs don't exist, right? I mean, not yet, not by the time of the migration, ideally. So that's, yeah, it might disincentivize the migration, is what I say. Cool. Then, okay, there is another problem, that if you have this P2MR, if you have this structure and you reuse addresses, then you have a problem still. If you spend the ECC leaf and then you reuse the address, then anybody can spend the coins. It doesn't matter if you say, okay, I will use only post-quantum transaction signatures. Your public key has already been exposed, and you decided the public key for this leaf, and you decided to reuse the address, then you're in trouble, right? So if you don't disable ECC ever, and you have reused addresses, you are still vulnerable. Basically, you are asking users also to take care of wallet hygiene, which is always good. Like, don't reuse addresses. It's always a good advice. But yes, it's not only reusing addresses, you have to avoid to share the descriptor with any third party. So there are additional things you're asking the users to do for this to work properly. And honestly, my opinion is that we will need to just disable ECC, also for P2MR. All right, we have another variation. This P2QR. And this is like P2MR, so there is no key path. And in addition, you disable all ECC opcodes. So in this output, okay, this variation of Taproot does not allow you to use elliptic curve cryptography as a spending condition among all these leaves. There is no ECC signature here. So here there is no risk related to having exposed this ECC public key. And yeah, that's good. You have maximum certainty that the vulnerability or the attack from CRQCs cannot be applied to this output. But this is the worst in terms of migration incentives, because if you migrate to this output, then to spend these coins, you have to go through a more expensive method. There is no cheap option here. They're all post-quantum. They're all based on post-quantum crypto. So that's the maximum cost, and this affects, again, the migration incentives and your model on how many coins will migrate to a post-quantum transaction output. Okay, then we have this, I would say, major alternative, or anyway, different approach compared to P2MR. And this is P2TR version 2, P2TRv2, another variation of Taproot. And yeah, I would describe this as like Taproot. It's exactly like Taproot, but in addition, it allows you to add a post-quantum transaction signature in the Merkle tree that describes all the spending conditions for this output type. And these are all in addition to the elliptic curve cryptography keypad spend that is still there. Because again, this is like Taproot, same trade-offs, like same efficiency benefit, but also vulnerable at rest. And it's really just adding the possibility to define a post-quantum transaction signature in the spending condition. This is what P2TRv2 is. And yeah, it might feel weird. You propose as post-quantum transaction output something that is vulnerable to long exposure attacks. It can feel weird, but there is a very important aspect here that is about the confiscation and the steal or freeze dilemma. The thing is, this output makes very explicit that ECC must be disabled at some point. There is no other way. It has to be disabled. Otherwise, CRQCs will sweep these coins, right? There is no way to hide them. They are there. They're embedded in the output, and they're publicly available. So the idea here is that if users migrate to P2TRv2, they basically accept a social contract that says that ECC will be disabled. So if that is true, disabling ECC cannot be seen as confiscation. And I mean, disabling ECC only for this output cannot be seen as confiscation. And this is removing all this uncertainty on how to best deal with the steal or freeze dilemma. Because in other cases, when you disable ECC and it's not necessarily expected in the same way, when you disable ECC, you are freezing the coins. And if you don't disable ECC, you allow people to steal the coins. But here there is not this dilemma anymore, because this disabling is accepted by the user when they do actively the migration. This is an argument in favor of P2TRv2, P2Taproot v2. But there is more, because there is another very good thing of P2TRv2, of course, is that it keeps the same efficiency as Taproot, because it is like Taproot. It's just only this is the change, the additional PQ leaf possible. So everything that works for Taproot works also for P2TRv2, and that's an additional incentive here. This means that this is the lowest friction migration that one can imagine, because you are really not asking much from the users. You're not asking them to change their workflows. You're not asking them to pay more when they need to spend. So it really feels frictionless, almost frictionless. I mean, you still need to spend the coins, but that's the main advantage compared to something like MR. And there is the question of confiscation still, but in my opinion, even with P2MR, there is an expectation that at least eventually ECC will be disabled. But yeah, that's another question. And what is the risk? Here you really need to disable ECC at some point. And this means that you have to deal with this question on when to disable ECC. So you get rid of the steal or freeze dilemma or the confiscation dilemma, but still you have to do this disabling. And the question is when and how. So we talked about this in the lost coins video with tripwire or the miner threshold, but you have to do this right, and it's not obvious. It's not obvious. Then we have P2TRH, and this is very similar to P2TRv2, but the public key related to the keypad spend is not publicly, it's hashed. So you cannot directly derive a private key from this hash. There is this hash on top of it. So this is similar to Taproot, but the keypad is hashed, and basically at this point, the output is not vulnerable to long exposure attacks. You don't have an ECC key exposed at rest. So, it's kind of a middle ground, but there is a question here on what do you really gain? Does it really matter, long exposure versus short exposure? And all the other questions are still there, and you are breaking some workflows. Yeah, it's a question whether this is a good trade-off or not, but I wanted to mention it as well. And now there is another point. This is cross-input signature aggregation. So cross-input signature aggregation is a possible upgrade through a soft fork that would allow to make transactions that spend many inputs at the same time and few outputs, like aggregations, consolidations. They can be much cheaper with this upgrade, with CISA. Now, it's good to know that this works very well together with P2Taproot v2. And in that case, really, every additional input is just 1 byte of extra weight. And that's awesome. It can make very efficient all these consolidations. So the idea here is that if you ship together CISA and P2Taproot v2, people might actually be very incentivized in doing the migration. And this is a way to make this first step towards post-quantum resistance, post-quantum readiness, more realistic. Because you want people to start migrating in advance. You need to give them incentives. So that's something that works in favor of P2TRv2, because you don't get the same benefits from aggregation on P2MR or P2TRH even. So there is this to be taken into account. And the last thing I want to mention is that, yes, it's true you cannot use CISA for P2MR, but there might be another way. There is progress in using zero-knowledge proofs to prove the existence of many valid post-quantum signatures, So instead of verifying each post-quantum signature one by one, that is expensive, you only verify the proof of the existence of all these signatures. So you can get all this efficiency also with the P2MR, also with ECC disabled. That would be amazing from a cost efficiency point of view. And suddenly we don't need to worry anymore about Bitcoin having 0.3 transactions per second or a bit more using shrimps and shrinks, but still low throughput. Suddenly we don't need to worry that much about that anymore. But of course, there are other questions like who's doing the proving? Yeah, it will be the miners. Who's relaying the signatures? Yeah, there are other questions. And also this has to be safe, of course. So the circuit that is proving the transaction signatures has to be safe and sound. It has to work. If you have bugs, it will be catastrophic. So this has to be really super, super safe, formally verified before it has any chance to make it into Bitcoin consensus. But it is a way. It is something that developers in Bitcoin and Ethereum, of course, for Ethereum, this is the way in the roadmap, but it's a possibility also for Bitcoin. And yeah, that's all I have for migration incentives. That's a big question, like which of these outputs will help in having this migration sooner rather than later. And you have to think about both incentives and disincentives. There's one thing is with CISA and P2TRv2, it might be even really an incentive to do migration, something good for you. You save money. But probably what is stronger here is the disincentive. So P2QR is strongly disincentivized because if you do that, then you accept that you will spend more to spend always. And I think that's more important than the migration incentive. But I don't know. And we will see because there will be more developments, more improvements. And yeah, I will be there to monitor as it's super interesting to me. And that's all. Thank you. Until the next video. Bye bye.